It's just after 5 o'clock. Good evening and welcome to the monthly meeting of the Burlington Board of Commissioners for the Electric Department, Electric Commission. We meet second Wednesday of the month, right here, 5 o'clock, 585 Pine Street. As usual, all welcome to come on down, share your thoughts and feelings and whatever comes up with the board. So let's start. Our first item on the agenda is the agenda. Do we have any changes, additions, subtractions, anything like that from board members? The only thing we're going to do here a little differently is our general manager is running a little bit late, so we're going to sort of float him down the list until he gets here. So that being said, we'll move on to item number 2, minutes of the October 16th, 2024 meeting. Other than typographical errors and anything like that that can be done on the side, are there any changes or anything to the adjustments to the minutes? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion.
I move to accept the minutes
We have
of
a
the October 16th meeting.
Motion made. Do I have a second?
Second.
Motion made and seconded. All in favor of accepting the minutes of October 16th as presented indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed indicate by saying nay. 5 ayes, no nays. The minutes passed. Move on to item number 3 on our agenda, which is public forum. This is a time for folks who are visiting us either here in the building or online to address the board. And do we have any people from the public? I don't recognize you, sir. So I don't see anybody online from the public. So you have the floor. If you just tell us who you are, yeah, step right up and let us know who you are, and we're here to listen.
Supposed to tap, right?
Yeah, it's not gonna, yeah.
Hey, my name is Steve Levy. I live right up the street on Locust Street, 106. I'm happy that this is a publicly owned utility, and I'm going to speak very briefly because I noticed recently there was a electric motorcycle rebate as part of the electric program. I've been riding an electric motorcycle this is my 3rd year. I have never seen anyone else in Burlington riding an electric motorcycle. I'd be curious if anybody else has gotten that $500 rebate. And I guess what I like to point out is that electric motorcycles are almost as expensive as cars. They're from $14,000 to maybe $30,000 for a Harley or a Yamaha electric motorcycle. I ride mine for more than 6 months of the year. I save about 50 gallons just from riding back and forth to New Haven, Vermont, where my girlfriend lives. So I don't understand the intent of the $500 rebate. I mean, don't you want to reward people like me who are forward-thinking and have already bought and are charging their motorcycles with Burlington Electric current? So I know that's kind of a difficult thing to do because of all the ifs, ands, and buts, but I don't know. We want to encourage that kind of thing, I think. I mean, they use a lot less electricity than 3,000-pound cars that are driving around with their batteries, and I can tell you from personal experience that it is great riding around Burlington with an electric motorcycle. There's no parking problem. There's no problem with people waiting to make left turns on Willard Street. There's no problem with drivers who don't know what they're doing. So that's my comment is, I guess I would say that maybe rewarding people each year for driving an electric motorcycle or even an electric car. I mean, why only pay when they actually buy the vehicle? You want to pay when they have it on the road, right? Yeah, that's my comment, and thanks for supplying me with electricity for my motorcycle, and you'll see me buzzing around.
A couple of questions I have.
Yeah.
Did you get I'm looking towards the folks that would know these things. Is that new for motors? As I've never even seen.
It wasn't
an electric
around 3 years
motorcycle.
ago when I looked.
And I'm just wondering whether or not you signed up to get the $500, and or if you signed up to get on the because I'm not sure if a motorcycle will cover it, but if Burlington Electric might be in a position to pay for a charger.
Well, it actually just charges. Mine is pretty small, so it just charges plugging into a regular outlet. I mean, I have a converter for whatever it is,
Like
the
level
charge point
2,
outlets
yeah.
if
Charge point, yeah.
if I'm stuck, but yeah, unless you buy extra equipment, it charges about 10 miles that you can get maybe each hour. So it's kind of an overnight charge thing, or gets about 100 miles on a charge. And no, I don't think it was in when I applied.
Well, I would suggest looking into, get on our, I don't have it in front of me right now, but get on our website here to see.
Yeah.
Because you may even qualify for.
No, it says you have to buy it within, you have to apply within 60 days. That's,
Yeah.
that was the whole caveat.
Right.
Yeah, so,
I mean, I know I just bought an EV and I got all kinds of incentives from the state, Burlington
Yeah.
Electric, the feds, everybody was.
yeah, and you didn't even have to buy a helmet with that, right?
No.
Yeah. I'll make another comment as long as I have the floor. About 2 years ago, I bought an induction stove. I'm like a food fanatic, and so I have my, chef's 4-burner gas stove with the griddle, and then on the side of it, I have an induction stove that I use most of the time, unless I'm firing up a wok or, cooking something really sizzling. And the language I remember in the rebate said that the stove had to be 26 inches. I think, I can't remember the exact measurement, but there was a limit on how small it could be. Mine happens to be 26 inches in this direction. It's a 2-burner. It sits on the side of my stove. And when I talked to whoever it is in charge, they said, oh, no, what we meant was, so I didn't get that rebate either. But I think it might be worth thinking about for people who want to put in auxiliary stoves, because I spent, more than $1,000 to put mine in, and
Yeah,
had to rewire my house and everything, so.
Yeah, I know our GM is just put one in.
Yeah. No, they're great. They don't, yeah, there's some, like if you have big 10-inch pots, mine's kind of like an 8-inch stove. Okay, so thank you for listening.
Yeah,
I
thanks for your
appreciate the
time.
open meeting. Were there any more questions? No? Okay. Feel free to come over and take a ride on my motorcycle if you want.
Yeah, I've never even seen them. That's cool.
I love the idea too.
yeah.
Because it's, the thing that's annoying about motorcycles is the noise, right?
Right, that's the other thing. It costs 3 times as much, but the noise, now I've spoken to other motorcycle riders, and they say, no, the whole point is to make noise.
Right, that's why we don't want, yeah.
Chair Moody,
Yeah,
could I just, before our guest leaves, make one suggestion?
yeah, go ahead.
Just gonna, for all the people listening. I don't know if you're familiar with our annual Net Zero Energy Festival that we have usually.
I meant to come down last year, I just have not made it, yeah.
If you're okay with it, I'd love to get your contact info. It'd be amazing to have you join us at next year's Net Zero Energy Festival, because we have electric vehicles there, and part of it is to showcase them for other people. It would be wonderful to have you there with your motorcycle. People could check it out, and that could
Yeah, I
lead.
could make that row sound.
We could do that.
Yeah, that would be super cool if you
Thank
could
you,
do
Chair
that.
Moody.
Yeah, thank you.
What's your?
And it does look like we have someone online, Amber. Oh, it's us. Okay. I don't recognize.
Yeah, Amber is one of my teams on
Fast. Okay. All right. Is there anybody else from the public for public comment? Going once, going twice.
Can I just respond?
Go
to
ahead.
that too?
Yeah, please.
Because
Yeah,
I
sure.
forget if that's the time now.
Sure.
I think the other thing, I mean, the GHG reduction too, from motorcycle engines to electric, would be interesting to understand the cost benefit of 500 to potential GHG reduction. I don't know what that looks like. I'm sure the calculations were done and had to be past the cost effectiveness test, but I'm curious about that as well. And then the other piece too, on the induction stove side, if there is a minimum requirement, I'm curious about renters and multifamily. If there is a smaller stove, like, is there some way to, I get probably wouldn't pass if it's an additive, like an auxiliary, but it might pass for a multifamily or a smaller rental property space. So just two additional thoughts.
Scott, if you want, I can quickly answer that.
Sure. Go right ahead, please.
James Gibbons, so a lot of our incentives are governed by what's called the Tier 3 Technical Advisory Group. So they are statewide calculations of savings, and the estimated savings from a measure set the maximum incentive that a utility can offer. we can offer as much or more than anybody per greenhouse gas reduction amount because we're 100% renewable, but there is still a limit on what we can provide based on the estimated savings. So there are some constraints on our programs in that respect, and also what measures they may have chosen to characterize. So how they characterize a stove or something like that can affect our programs. But I can certainly look into these questions that were raised and see if they were governed by the tag or governed by a policy desire that we had.
That's great.
Yeah, certainly.
Other stuff for public comment? Okay. Let's move on to, we're going to skip over the general manager update, so to give him time to get here. And we'll skip right down to financial review with Emily.
Okay. Good evening. We're going to walk through actual results for September. So in September, we had an actual net income of $238,000 compared to a budgeted net income of $329,000, so a $91,000 unfavorable variance to budget. Walking down from the top, you can see that sales to customers was better than budget by $280,000, and then other revenues was worse than budget. It was not a rec delivery month, so we had no power supply revenues received or budgeted. So most of the variance in the other revenues is from EEU reimbursements. Looking at expense, net power supply expense was unfavorable, worse than budget by about $153,000. Within that, you may remember that McNeil ran less than budget for a lot of the summer and was not budgeted to run a lot in September. And so we kind of made up for lost time in September by running McNeil more than budget. So a lot of that negative variance is driven by unfavorable fuel, fuel being higher than budget. However, we saved on fuel, in July and August compared to budget. Purchase power was favorable to budget. Again, we ran McNeil. We weren't budgeting to, so we didn't have to buy as much power from ISO exchange. And then transmission was very slightly unfavorable by $57,000. Other operating expense favorable, better than budget by $378,000. A lot of this is the correction of the invoice we talked about last month that was billed incorrectly. We reversed the billing, and so that increased or reduced expense essentially by $254,000, which hit the operating expense group. So, operating income was better than budget by $484,000. And other income and deductions, you'll see a pretty large variance there, $586,000. Most of that is due to the timing of anticipated FEMA public assistance funds, which we do anticipate receiving in the fiscal year. It just didn't come in September like we had estimated they would back in the spring. So overall, even though the total net income is less than budget, if you sort of mentally subtract that variance in other income, you can see that it was fairly close actually to budget. Or actually probably, better would have been better than budget if not for that variance and the timing of the receipt of FEMA grant funds. Questions, I'll keep going. Coming down here to capital spending. We had budgeted to spend about $4 million so far. As of September, we've spent about 1.8. That's about 16% of the total capital budget for the year. the usual story here with kind of the timing of the projects. And moving down to cash, total operating cash was 9.3 million. We had budgeted to be at 11.4, so that's a lot off from budget. However, the reason is primarily we had budgeted to receive our annual $3 million general obligation funds in September. The bonds were actually issued in October, so that's why we're about 3.1 million off from budget on the cash, on the operating cash. And then you can see here the at the bottom, the credit rating factors are fairly good for this month. 4.86 on the debt service coverage, 1.3 on the adjusted debt service coverage. With the line of credit, we're at 160 days. Without the line, we would be at 96. That is all, unless there are, happy to take questions.
Sue, I just have a question about the capital. So you're spending more slowly than anticipated, and that seems to be just the way it always goes. And is that just like, because when you do your planning and you lay out the projects, the expectation is that it's going to unfold in a certain way, and then there's just things that happen that prevent that from happening? So you can't really account for it or take it into consideration?
Yeah, I think certainly, Munir can comment about the distribution system projects and the generation projects, which are the bulk of the capital budget. I can speak to the software projects, which are kind of the biggest ones in my area. Sometimes when we're budgeting, we're still in an RFP process.
Oh, I see.
So we're kind of like, hey, we have a plan to choose a vendor by here, and then we have a plan to get the contract signed by this point in time, but then sometimes those things take longer than expected. So that's probably that is the major variance in terms of the software system, and those tend to be the big implementations are the biggest amount of that category. More simple IT projects like replace a switch, we're pretty well on top of. It's just order the switch, get it in, get it installed. If you want to.
Yeah, and for the distribution capital projects, we budgeted for the replacement of 3 switches based on the understandings they're going to be here sometimes in September. They were delayed to October, now to January. We received one of the 3 switches in October. However, it was missing some equipment, some fuses, so now we're trying to find those fuses to put them on it. And that's the reason, really, that's about over like $1 million just worth of equipment. And then we still have transformers from over a year ago that we ordered that we have not received. And if what we have in the budget, like over close to $1.5 million worth of transformers that we're receiving little chunk by little chunks. And every few months they delayed the delivery date. Now we're have some understandings that we're going to get some transformer by the December for the transformer portion that we're supposed to get last March, April. And then for the generation project, the loose key, bladder replacements, we couldn't really find the contractor to install it by the time early in the fall. That's why it's a little bit delayed. But it's the project is ongoing right now.
Okay, so nothing that you could have anticipated really, or?
No, but we go out for bid and they tell
Yeah,
us when they're going to be
everyone
delivered.
promises, yeah.
We do the budget based on those assumptions.
And we are, finance and engineering kind of meet with purchasing quarterly, and we go through, like, okay, when's the switch coming? What's the latest? Do we need to call the vendor? Kind of just to keep track of what is the expected timing, and to try to forecast where we're going to be at the end of the year as best we can. So.
And we have also swapped some of these projects that were supposed to happen in the spring. We're doing them now. And then when the switches comes in, we'll do them in the springtime.
So you're always playing catch up and leapfrogging.
Constantly, yeah, constantly. Good question.
Other questions? Hearing none. Are we ready for a GM update? Slide that in the middle here.
Apologies. Sometimes home projects come up at the least opportune times, so I had to run home and come back. We just had a couple items on the GM update, first of which we're really grateful to the community for the support for the Net Zero Energy Revenue Bond, nearly 80%. Back in December 2021, we had a 70% margin, which was also really strong, but this was even better. So we're excited about that. I think it positions us really well, particularly as we head into a period of time where I think we're going to have some challenges with federal policy in particular, that we are going to have the resources here to make capital investments. We're going to have the matching resources to support the EV charging grant, which we're working very hard to make sure is fully obligated, ready to go. And I think we're going to be in just a stronger financial position because of it. So we're really grateful for that. I should mention as well that there was a discussion, I think last night at City Council, relative to the GO bonds, which we get $3 million a year annually. The city has $2 million a year, I believe, from that. There may be others, the school district, others that get general obligation bonds. I think there was an effort last night to have a charter change referred to committee to be considered for the town meeting day ballot that would, over a period of time, increase the city's borrowing capacity under the GO bond, I believe from $2 million to $5 million, eventually to $10 million. Also to add the water department with the allocation of $6 million. So BED currently gets 3. We've long thought that that was not adequate to the task, partly why we're doing revenue bonds as we are. So we're also included there as going from 3 to 6. If that were to pass, charter change and be enacted, it would give us some options, particularly down the road as the revenue bond spending is completed towards the end of the decade, to be able to continue to fund the capital program without needing to raise rates as much. If there were other more extraordinary capital needs that were, necessity, gives us more tools in the toolbox for that. So I just want to give the commission a heads up that that could be on the town meeting day agenda, along with a number of other things. But we're really grateful that on the November ballot, we had the support of the community for the net zero revenue bond. Wanted to also provide an update on the energy benchmarking ordinance. So that, again, springs from this conversation that started with this idea of a building emission reduction ordinance that Councilor Broderick introduced. The two considered, we brought forward the energy benchmarking ordinance as a first step. It was considered at council. It's being held over till December 9th. We're reaching out, having feedback from people whose buildings might be impacted. Had some conversations with the University of Vermont and others. I think we may have to do some updates to look at how we treat particularly campus or institutional buildings that are not separately metered or sub-metered, because those are really challenging to kind of even estimate the space heating loads. So I think that there may be some language that we'll seek to include to address that scenario. But other than that, I think there's support, hopefully, for advancing the policy on December 9th, and then we anticipate working on the building emission reduction policy that would follow on the benchmarking in the first half of 2025. Also wanted to mention, it wasn't in the written report, but could be a December agenda item, so I'll mention it now, is we did close out around Halloween the RFPs that you all looked at along with TUC. We received one response to the forestry RFP, and we received 3 responses to the emissions reduction assessment RFP. We're reviewing those. We met today as a team to go over them. We have some potential follow-up we want to do with each of the respondents before we can evaluate and formally score what we think the applications should be looking like. But we'll be bringing those, per the process, back to the commission, back to the TUC, back to the council with a recommendation and a potential scope of work. And we may be able to bring that, it may be timely for the December agenda item, in which case I don't think we have to do a joint meeting again necessarily, but we can bring it here. We'll bring it to TUC in December, and then we can bring it to council in January to seek to have a scope of work for each of those items. A couple of the responses were outside of the budget, one by a large amount and one by a less significant amount, but still outside of the budget. I'd like to stick to the budget if possible, so part of our work may be looking at the scope and seeing what we can get within budget. 2 of them were within budget, so those will also merit consideration. And then lastly, but exciting always, for any commissioners who want to join, we have the calendar contest. The annual calendar contest winners will be here in the Spark space next week on the 21st, 5:30. That's for the elementary school fourth graders and their families and their teachers and administrators who are part of that. And obviously, regardless whether you can join, we'll look forward to getting each of you a calendar at the December meeting with all the great artwork that our fourth graders have produced around electrification, efficiency, the environment, et cetera. So we're looking forward to that, and glad to answer any questions.
The only question that comes up, well, two things. Well, last Tuesday, the people spoke, not only here but around the country. And the one thing that, relative to here, gives me pause is and across the industry, are people bracing for losing EV or incentives, the electrification incentives, given the incoming administration?
I think, actually, the more immediate EV issue is at the state level, interestingly, because the state rebate program ran out of money. My understanding is that they're going to look at, maybe even in the Budget Adjustment Act, which takes place usually in January, trying to get funding back for the state rebates, which are an important source for a number of folks. At the federal level, those are in legislation, so anything that would undo those would have to go through legislation, including typically in the Senate having a 60-vote margin to be able to break any kind of a filibuster. The one exception to that is if you go through the budget reconciliation process, where you're doing legislation that can reduce the deficit, you can go by a bare majority in the Senate. So these types of incentives and other programs in the Inflation Reduction Act would be potentially subject to change in that process. I have some level of hope that there is enough support on a bipartisan basis for some of those programs and incentives. I think the clean energy industry more broadly is dispersed pretty well geographically across the country, including in all different states, all different regions. And I do think that there is support for solar, for electric vehicles, for manufacturing. So I'm somewhat hopeful that there will be effort to oppose those types of changes. And at the same time, I think what we should be aware of is that anything that has to do with EPA rulemaking, executive orders, those are going to likely change, and there's not going to be a mechanism other than potentially litigation, which could take place to affect that. So I'm hopeful for the Inflation Reduction Act incentives and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act incentives that they'll be able to stay. Our immediate focus, I don't know if this came up at all, but is really just to make sure the federal grants we have are obligated prior to any change. I know that the Building Giants grant, which we've talked about, which is helping us with the heat pump bill credit program eventually that we're going to roll out, as well as a commercial program, which we may also be maybe in a position to brief you on in December on the commercial side. That's obligated, and our EV charging funding we're working on having obligated in the very near future, hopefully, fingers crossed. So those are kind of some of the immediate things we're thinking about relative to the change in administration. Yeah.
Other questions? Andy? No?
I had the same question, so.
Yeah, I mean, it is exciting that the bond passed with such a large margin.
It really is. I think it's a credit to the organization, the trust that hopefully we've generated in the community. It's focused on reliability and net zero. Those are things that I think by and large people are very supportive of. Electrification, having more reliability, building the capacity for the grid so that we can support all the projects, both at the residential level, the commercial level, and the institutional level. And I think when Emily and I went around, met at the MPA meetings, we had a sense that there was a lot of support for this concept and continue to make these investments. So it's gratifying, certainly, and I view it as a credit to the organization and the trust that the team has built collectively in the community. Yeah. I'm glad to have it in hand. And obviously we had an interest rate cut again, so we'll be monitoring that environment as we go into 2025. We obviously still have some spend to do with the current revenue bond before we're in need of using the new one. But certainly as we head into the next budget year, we'll be looking and planning for this.
there any changes in the state? Because we elected, will impact.
Yeah, I think the biggest question, right, is going to be around the clean heat standard. Because that was passed initially as a process. The PUC is doing rulemaking, reporting, all different types of things, trying to set up a potential structure. The PUC has already signaled that they're going to also propose a fee on heating fuels as an alternative, like a thermal efficiency fee. I don't know if there is the desire or political will to implement something like that. They'll also report out on the clean heat standard. Last time when that came to a vote, obviously the governor had vetoed it. It was overridden. I don't know that there would necessarily be the same dynamic at play. So that policy and the future of that policy is definitely up for consideration in 2025, and I don't know where it'll end up. It is important, I think, for a variety of steps we want to take in Vermont, and it would be a tailwind potentially to some of the efforts we're making in Burlington, but we also have strong policy here with the rental weatherization, the carbon fee. There was a story, by the way, on the rental weatherization process in 7 days about how it's going slower than many had hoped, although I think our team, Chris Burns, had anticipated we would have a shortage of workforce and budget programs to kind of carry it at the pace that the council originally prescribed. But overall, we do have good policies in Burlington, so I think we'll continue to make progress. But that would have been a nice tailwind, and we're still hopeful that maybe there can be discussions around that. But I wouldn't predict what might come out of it or what the report might look like from the PUC.
More questions? Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Sorry
you.
again for
No worries.
the tardiness.
Life happens. All right, on to item number 7, FY24 audited financials.
I didn't miss Paul Alexander. That was
No,
I want to be
the star
here
of
for
the
that.
show. No,
That's
not yet.
important.
Okay. What's that black box? I think it's fine.
Yeah. All right, so I asked Amanda, our controller, to present this evening. She did, and the accounting team, the work on preparing the financial statements. So I thought it would be a good opportunity for her to present the commission and walk you through. All you.
Thanks. So the first statement that we have here is called the Statement of Net Position, and it's also commonly referred to as a balance sheet outside of GASB rules. The first thing you'll see here, capital assets, the top here, which is net depreciation. The black box is kind of in the way, but once we scroll, you might be able to see. I don't know what the box is, but the 2023, there we go. So this balance increased just about $3 million, and that's pretty expected given we're pretty invested in investing in our physical plant and making improvements to our physical plant. So that was expected, a good increase there. Another positive increase that we saw this year was in our cash position. As you can see, about a $3.5 million increase from 2023. We do know, and we have noted before, that our cash position at the end of 2023 was pretty low, not where we would have wanted to be. So it is a positive trend to see such an increase in the cash balance this year, and we'll kind of get into the details of why that increased in like 4 pages when we go over the cash flow statement. Other things on this statement are kind of like accounts receivable that we have at the end of the year, some unbilled revenues, some inventory values. None of those changed too significantly, so I wasn't going to go into a ton of detail on those. The other balance I wanted to point out that did change significantly, you'll see right under the non-current assets, it's called restricted investments deposits with bond trustees. So this really relates to our construction fund that we've been talking about, the 2022 revenue bond. This went down $5 million compared to 2023, and that's all due to the spending that we've been doing on that bond. So we've been drawing funds from it pretty related to above the net capital assets. You kind of see that flow from that restricted investments line up into that capital assets line, as that's where we're spending a lot of that money. Also included here's some regulatory assets, renewable energy standard inventory that we have, and then our equity investments as well. Not many changes other than those three that I noted, but before we move on to the liabilities page of the statement of net positions, any questions on the assets?
So the equity interest, that's like Belco and?
Yep.
Yep.
Yep, and we didn't make any new investments during fiscal year '24, so that balance stayed the same. All right, moving on then, we've got the other page of the same statement. So we're still on the statement of net positions, and this one is focusing on our liabilities. So all the things we kind of owe at the end of the year. A lot of the items on here are our debt holdings. At the top, you can see our current portion, so those are amounts that are due in the next 1 year. I'll skip a few lines there, and then you'll see the long-term debt there, which is everything above 1 year through the maturity of the bond. Generally, with the revenue bonds, we're going to see those decreasing each year as we pay off principal payments that are due. The only time we would expect to see that really increase is obviously when we issue a new revenue bond. General obligation bonds tend to stay fairly consistent year over year, given that we have a new $3 million bond each year, and then we're paying off portions of our old bonds. So not too big of changes in that. The one thing I wanted to point out here that you'll see, the net pension liability increased by $1.2 million. This is entirely driven by actuarially determined assumptions and changes in the markets. A couple of big things that changed this year were really the plan's investment performance. So we typically see fairly big fluctuations in those based on the actuary report. And then if you see all the way at the bottom here, our total net position increased by a little under $2 million, which is a positive change. $1.2 million. Obviously, going through all of those things, there's a lot of ups and downs between assets and liabilities, but overall, it's really positive to see a positive increase in net position from last year. Any questions on the liability side?
Yeah, I have a question. Can you go back to the non-current liabilities? It's sort of an eye-popping number.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the $45 million of general obligation debt. Is that multiple years of like how far back does that go?
2011.
Like,
yes.
Like 20-ish years of.
Yes. Not quite that far back. I can't remember exactly.
Hold on, we'll go to the right footnote, we can tell you exactly. There's a little sub-schedule. 5.
Yes, no 5. Right here.
Almost there. So,
2011 is the first one that we still have outstanding, if you go up.
oh, sorry. Oh, yeah.
The first one there.
2011B.
That's the furthest back that we currently still owe on.
I see. And some of those other bonds were larger than, they're not always $3 million bonds, or is that, what were the?
They're all $3 million. Sometimes we'll get it at a premium and sometimes we'll get it at a discount. But the face value, as far as I know, has always been $3 million. As far as I've seen back, I think.
Yeah. There was an exception around the financial crisis in 2009 or 10, where we had been about to issue a revenue bond. We've been planning for one, and then the financial crisis hit, and the sort of markets all froze up, and so the city ended up issuing general obligation debt on our behalf because we couldn't issue the revenue bond debt that we had planned to.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the one exception that I know of historically. there may be some refinancings.
Yes.
So it could be,
2016.
we would have to investigate, we could certainly look into it, but like that 6.2 million, I think is probably a combination issuance and refinancing, or maybe it's like a separate refinancing of that previous 2009 issuance at that.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Yeah. I was just curious what was comprising that fairly large number.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see there's, there's a list from 16, actually, so here, yeah, that's definitely what was going on here. You can see in 2016, there's an A, a B, and a C.
Right.
So we issued actually 3 bonds that year, and then, and a D. So that's why it's a little bit more than, kind of like just 3 million times 13 years. That makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah. Whiz back to where we were.
Page 14.
And is that common for utilities to be so highly leveraged like that? It is? And is that because you need assets, the cash flow, you're not really allowed to, you spend all that money on operations, so you don't have any, like, the savings account, so to speak, is,
Right, we have a really large asset base, and we have access to a relatively low cost of capital. So we have a high need to invest every year because we have a large asset base, but because we are, a monopoly and part of the city, and we have a decent credit rating, we can obtain financing at quite attractive interest rates, generally speaking. So that is common for utilities to sort of be debt financing engines, or to have a fairly, or to use debt financing to fund their capital plans. Yeah.
Any other questions before we move on?
Okay. I would just add also, Beth, that if you think about kind of what are the alternatives to debt financing, right? We would have to collect in rates enough that we are putting aside sufficient cash to then sort of pay for those capital investments out of pocket, so to speak, right? So if you can sort of think about the rate impact that would be if we had to every year collect $3 million more from ratepayers instead of borrowing $3 million and then paying it off over 20 years.
right, sort of
Right.
just like a household budget too. It's hard to get the capital, build the capital that you need to make a purchase, a big purchase, but likewise, once you've bought into it, you can't really get out from under it. It's really hard to get out from under it. Like, if you didn't want to continue to borrow money every year to maintain your capital program, it's so hard because you got 45 million, you've got to pay, you're always paying that back, and that prevents your savings, so to speak. Like, if you weren't paying the debt, you could put it in your own savings account and draw that down for but that's just the way government works, I think, because, yeah. And you don't get any federal grants or anything like,
Sometimes we do.
for specific things, though.
Right.
Not
yeah.
for state of good repair or, right.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, federal grant is gonna fund reconductoring of, the line or something like that, but that's stuff we have to do. Or a new switch,
All right. Next statement that we have here is called the Statement of Revenues, Expenses, and Changes in Net Position, also referred to as the income statement. So you can see here at the top, sales to customers was up just under $4 million. Other revenues were down by about $2.4 million. The sales to customers increased. We had a 5.5% rate increase that was effective September 1 of 2023. The other revenues that you see here consist mostly of REC sales, which is renewable energy credits, and also reimbursements from our EEU fund, which is our Energy Efficiency Utility Fund. And this decrease that you see here of the 2.4 relates to both of those factors. And then if we move down, so the top of this statement here that we're going to look at really relates to the primary operating activities of BED, the revenues expenses that occur for our utility operations, kind of also referred to as above the line activities, with the line being the line that you see there of operating loss and income. So a couple of the operating expenses that fluctuated significantly this year that we wanted to touch on. You'll see total operating expenses increased by $2.8 million this year. I do want to remind a couple of you that might remember from last year, we had received regulatory approval to reduce the purchase power expense line in 2023 by a little over $4 million and establish a regulatory asset for that amount that we're going to now expense over 8 years. And that was due to the milder than expected winter that we had anticipated. So if you consider the fact that we reduced that purchase power line by just over $4 million that in 2023, the total operating expenses with that still included actually decreased by about $1.2 million. So it does look here that our expenses increased, but if you factor in that adjustment that we made last year for that regulatory asset, it wasn't as bad as it might look here. So some other big things that changed here. So production expense decreased by a little over $1.5 million. This was really due to decreased fuel expense at McNeil from decreased production levels during the year. Purchase power, again, similar story to what I just went over. It looks like it increased a pretty significant amount this year, but given that $4 million decrease in the expense last year, it remained fairly consistent considering that. Let's see. So we've got a couple other lines here that remain consistent. So other power supply expenses, transmission, distribution, pretty minor changes in those lines. You see a fairly big drop in the customer accounting service and sales expense line of about $1.2 million, and that's mainly attributable to the decrease in EEU program expenses, which relates above to the decrease in the other revenues. They're kind of hand in hand of the activity that we see through that EEU program. So a lot of that decrease relates there. And then in the administrative and general line, you see about a $1.4 million increase, and that's almost entirely related to salaries, pension, and other related benefits related to salaries. So overall for the year, for the operating activities, we see a loss of $134,000, and that's really just related to the core operations of BED. If you look down a little bit further, you see that our it's called the increase in net position, but that's essentially our net income for the year, excuse me, is $1.25 million. So now we'll kind of go through what helps us get from the loss of $134,000 to the net income for the year of $1.25. The biggest contributing factors here, obviously, are dividends. We continue to see strong dividends from those equity holdings. Pretty consistent. Like I said, we didn't make new investment in 2024, so the dividend amounts remain consistent given that. The big swings here that we saw from last year is the interest income, the unrealized should be gain on investment. Those are based on the market and the rates that we were seeing in our accounts that we're earning on our investments and our bank balances. And then the other big swing that you see here is grant income of $650,000 for the year. 500 and what was my amount? 60,000 of that was received for the purchase of our electric bucket truck. Just something fun to note there. So with all of those contributing factors, it gets us to a net position of $1.2 million. Like I mentioned before, the top part is really focused on the main nitty-gritty operations that we need to run to provide utility power and such, and then the rest of it is considered under the line income and expenses, but really do play a big part in allowing us to continue to run and getting us to a net position increase of 1.2 for the year. And like I mentioned on the last statement, our net position increased by that amount, and that's a really strong indicator for us.
So what do you do with that $1.2 million then? I mean, so if BED essentially made 1.25 million, where does that money go? Because you're not paying it to stockholders or anything, right? Or employee bonuses or whatever.
Can you start? Want me to
You go
start?
ahead first.
Okay. So the first thing to say about that is not all of that is cash. Okay, and Amanda's about to walk through the cash flow statement, which is kind of why there's 3 statements. And there's, as she'll explain, a difference in this income statement is based on accrual basis, and sort of you book the revenue or the expense when it occurs, but not necessarily when you pay the bill or you get the cash received. Whereas then the cash flow statement is all about timing of cash actually arriving and departing. I would say the second thing is that this is why when we talk about the adjusted debt service coverage ratio, a lot of these below the line things are excluded from coming up with that ratio. So that's why when Moody's is looking at the question of, are you generating enough revenues sufficient to pay your regular expenses and pay your debt service with a cushion, they're not looking at dividend expenses and what you might have got on grants this year, because it's not routine, it's not predictable. Well, dividends is, but it's not sort of core to the business, right? And things like interest and grants are kind of lumpy and unpredictable and not routine. And really it flows to our cash reserves. It flows to that operating cash, the part that is cash of that 1.25 million net position. And that's not really the total net position is the 66 million. That's not the same as cash reserves. That's the net position when you consider assets minus liabilities. Okay, so the change in the increase in net position, this is the piece of that increase in net position that flows from the operating, from the profit and loss statement, from the income statement.
So I get, it more or less makes sense. So you've generated a little bit of extra income, but you need to use that to cover your normal operations and and just the cash flow part of it. So a little bit rainy day, but also just maintain a healthy balance in your checkbook.
Yes.
And I think my question is sort of, from a taxpayer's perspective, we're asking for more, whatever, I don't know, $2 million a year or something like that. But if we have $1 million left over, why do we still need to go ask for more? And I think that's sort of the thing that is curious to me.
People may not realize that we have to start the year with a cash position of, typically I think 7+ or 8 million, just to be kind of, in the right spot, just to start off the year, and then to balance the various expenditures and other things. I mean, the truth of the question is, if we were in an outstanding position where we were earning $6, $7, $8 million a year of net income, you would get to a point where, and that was repeated, and which we're not. We're typically in the kind of $1 million, a little over $1 million range, which is good, healthy, but not quite at that level. You would get to a point where either you would have no rate increases, which we obviously did that for 12 years, or you could even get to a point, rare as it is, where you could have a rate decrease or something along those lines if you were in a really extraordinary position. But you're correct, there is no shareholder the money goes to, so it's either stays within the organization in capital or in cash, or it is returned eventually to the ratepayers in the form of a rate hold or a rate decrease if you got to that type of extraordinary position. We're not fortunate enough to be in that position at the moment, but that's what would happen.
And you like to set your rates to be about this feels good, like having $1 million.
The rule of thumb that the Department of Public Service uses is what's called it's a times interest earned ratio. So essentially they say, you can make a net income that's equal to twice what you pay in interest on your debt. And that's reasonable, it's not too rich, it's not too poor.
Yep.
You know, it's healthy.
Okay, that makes sense.
So I would have to kind of figure out exactly what is our interest on here?
It's grouped in with amortization.
Okay, yeah. But yeah, that's part of what the analysis we do when we submit our cost of service, and we ask ourselves the question, you know, two-part question, right? Like, what rate increase do we think we need to make the budget work to end with the right amount of cash and the right adjusted debt service coverage ratio? But the second related question is, what amount of increase do we believe we can justify using, you know, the methodology, and that results in a net income that's no greater than the two-tier? And so we kind of, you know, that's why we've filed for cases where, using the two-tier rule of thumb, we could have justified a higher rate increase than what we asked for. We settled or budgeted for a lower net income than the rule of thumb would have indicated.
Historically, is that net position how much does it vary year to year? And you'd expand, you know, relative to rate either?
Relative to?
Well, I was just thinking, you know, we're comparing the year before, but just thinking back 5 years, 10 years, when we didn't have rate increases, were there any kind of considerations relative to the historical?
Yeah, I mean, we've had net losses, definitely, some years, and commissioners here will remember those, particularly in the pandemic. We've had years where we had a net income of like less than $100,000, where we essentially broke even on the year. And then I think back when rec prices were higher and we were in that period of 12 years where we could afford to maintain things without increasing rates, we had some years of positive net positions kind of accumulating up. And as Darren said, we just used those to roll forward to a next year's budget where we didn't need to increase rates, and we could still offer COLAs, and we could, you know, still do the things that we needed to do in the budget.
Not to belabor, because this is an interesting area, though. The Department of Public Service is the regulator. You know, we view our customers as our customers, but they view our customers as their client in any rate proceeding. So they're the lawyer for the people, for the ratepayers, for the public. And if they feel that we are, or anybody, asking for more than we should, or more than is justified, they have the ability to recommend, you know, knocking down a rate request. They also have the ability to recommend a rate decrease if they ever feel a utility is pulling in more than they should, and has the ability to return money back to the ratepayer. And, you know, having been there, a deputy commissioner for a few years, they, you know, enjoy that work because they're doing it on behalf of the customer and the ratepayer and their client. So when there's an opportunity to request less, they'll do it without hesitation. So that's why it's impressive, although I don't think it gets a lot of attention, that the rate cases we've had, as hard as they are for us to bring forward and as hard as it is for customers to see a rate increase, because nobody wants that, they've been well justified, and they've always been approved at the level that they've been requested, because our team really does dig in on what is an appropriate level, and if it wasn't, they would recommend a decrease. I'm very confident of that.
Thank you.
Cash flow?
Yes, statement of cash flows.
This one is small.
Yeah, this is small print, so I apologize. So this kind of tells a story about how our cash balance increased so significantly this year. You'll see this, the labels of this kind of mirror to the income statement that we just went over. I do want to point out the numbers here are not going to line up with that income statement. Piggybacking on what Emily said just a couple minutes ago, our income statement's prepared on an accrual basis, so we record the expense when it's incurred and not necessarily when the cash is paid out for it. And this is on the cash basis, showing actual cash out the door. So, for example, the transmission expense there, it's really focused on the expense that we had on the income statement side, and then it also considers any payables for that we had last year and payables that we currently have sitting on our liabilities at the end of this year. So it kind of calculates out what cash would have been actually paid out for the year, not just what expenses we had. So They do remain fairly similar to the income statement amounts, but they differ in ways. So you'll see here, the net cash provided by operating activities was $7.6 million this year, which is really strong for our operating activities, and a big increase of about $5.1 million from last year. And most of that really relates to the decreased spending on the purchase power and power production expense lines. The rest of them stayed fairly consistent with last year. If we're moving down, we saw a slight increase in cash outlay for capital and related debt financing activities, mostly related to just paying off some of that debt that we have. And we got some new debt this year as well. And then a bit of a decrease in our cash outlay for non-capital financing activities, again, related to that grant income for the most part. And then in the investing activities section, I've mentioned this a little bit before, but the biggest swing that we saw this year was really related to those interest and dividends that we saw an increase in this year. And our overall net increase in cash for the year was about just under $3.5 million.
If I remember,
Anything
that
to
amount
add?
does tie to balance sheet, right?
The cash?
Yeah,
Yes.
the cash and cash.
It better.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And then the last two statements here relate to the Energy Efficiency Utility EEU fiduciary fund that we hold. Not a lot of crazy activity on this balance sheet here. Balance has stayed pretty consistent from last year, a little drop in the net position, but no crazy changes. And I think the biggest thing to note is on the next page, which is the fiduciary fund's kind of income statement. A lot more simplified than the one you saw for BED, but the biggest thing to note here, total additions, which is essentially like the revenues to the fund, stayed very consistent. Some fluctuations with the makeup of those revenues, but overall, very consistent revenue amounts for the year. The biggest change you'll see is in the deductions portion, $4.5 million in 2023 and only $2.9 in 2024. And this kind of goes back to the couple of times I mentioned it in the BED statements, how the other income was down, a little bit related to EEU, and then some of those expenses on like the customer service line were decreased related to the EEU. So all kind of plays in together based on the fact that we're the fiduciary fund, how it flows between the two. But the biggest change there was the payments for programs. There was a significant decrease in spending, and a lot of that relates to the limited district energy initiative costs that were incurred in 2024 compared to in 2023.
So is this the EEC collect, that's the little line item that we have on our bill that?
Yeah. Yep.
And it looks like the only way that this is solvent is because you have a balance from previous years? Because you're spending 2.7, or you're only collecting 2.1, 2.8, but you're spending 2.9.
Yeah.
So you still have funds left over from previous years?
Yep.
Correct.
I don't know enough, so I don't know if this is maybe in a couple months question versus right now question, but the recent ISO ruling on efficiency inclusion, is that going to have an impact on, funding and how you're going to?
Inclusion in which market?
There's again, this is where I don't know enough, so if you didn't, maybe we can dig in the future, but there's some kind of efficiencies being, is not going to be valued as part of the markets. Let me do some more digging. But
It might be, just, and glad to go more
Yeah.
into it. So the forward capacity market item
Right.
there, that's always, there's the traditional energy efficiency with the EEC.
Right.
And then there's the TEPF, the Thermal Energy Process Fuel Fund, which we use to pay for some of our district energy work based on legislation that allowed it. But traditionally, that's gone to unregulated fuel support. So we mentioned earlier, like the PUC is proposing a charge potentially on fuels. that would pay for thermal energy work, but traditionally there hasn't been one. So either we or Efficiency Vermont can use two other revenue sources, which is the RGGI money, the Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and then the forward capacity market. So forward capacity has traditionally been an efficiency can bid in, and then we get a piece of the benefit, and Efficiency Vermont gets a piece of the benefit.
And I think there's a potential ripple of forward capacity market exclusion of efficiency.
Could
So,
be.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know enough again, but
Yeah.
it might be something to pay attention to.
No, we could definitely come back to it. Thankfully, it's not an enormous portion of our efficiency revenue, but the other wrinkle here is that we've been able to use some of our EEC money for creative, innovative things through Act 44 that supplement those forward capacity and regional greenhouse gas initiative items. But yeah, I bet James would love to dig in on it.
We already have two things from the very beginning. United again on some.
Any other questions on the financial statement?
Thank you.
No? Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nice job.
All right, move on to item number 8, the one you've all been waiting for. BED's 2024-25 property, boiler, and machine insurance renewal.
I had hoped to have some hype music ready, but I didn't. There, drum roll.
Laser light show.
Oh, there's a wave in the crowd.
He's been waiting all year for this. Lighters up.
Okay, see my screen. Thank you for that introduction. Last but not least, the newer members, I haven't sat through this, you're in for quite a show. BED's property boiler machinery insurance renewal. So this comes up every year. This is by far our major line of insurance. So we've got anywhere from 14 to 20 lines of insurance. Some we share with the city. This is a standalone line, and it's a beast, and takes a lot of work. Hickok and Boardman, which is now labeled under Ackershore, it does a lot of work for months behind the scenes. So this is really an accumulation of that product. I'm just going to scroll down there. I've got plenty of slides off to the side, but really this is really a narration of the process, and happy to answer questions anytime. So right up front, the recommendation, just to back up, you're not necessarily third in line, but depending on when the meetings fall, I just want to let you know that on November 4th, this came to the Board of Finance, and that went through consent agenda without any comments. And again, last night at City Council. So your vote is important. I'm just saying that you're third in line here tonight. Okay?
Typically would go the other way around.
Yes, and it really
Yeah.
just depends on when. The numbers don't come in, so in October, you say, well, this line renews November 20th, so we really don't have any numbers, and they're still not final. So that's why this is right now and not to exceed, as it was last year and has been several years. If you know anything about insurance, particularly this large line, it goes right down to the last, like the 19th or the 20th, before we actually know the final number, but it's not to exceed. We never go beyond that. So anyways, in the recommendation right up front is that I'm asking you tonight to approve our property, boiler, and machinery insurance. There are 4 carriers. This line is a beast, so typically you have one insurance, like maybe for your house, your auto. One carrier. This has 4 lines, AIG, Zurich, StarTech, and Aegis, that together make up this policy. And it runs from November 20th of 24 through 25. And again, this is this year I'm asking a not-to-exceed premium of $715,989. Okay, the handouts that are in your package, and I do have them at the very end, but we're not going to go through them unless you have specific questions. Hickok and Boardman has a cover letter they write to me every year. We have ourselves, from myself, a BD property, boiler, machinery, a history of 25 to 30 years, and a line chart, if you will, that shows some of the spikes we've suffered through. Hickok and Boardman, number 3, a property quota share program, and that's really like a pie chart. It's a bar graph, but it really gives a nice summary of the 4 insurance carriers and what percentages they share in this line. And lastly, my cover letter to you and the other entities. So again, just if you haven't heard this before, this line of insurance covers our physical assets. So reading here is covers perils. That means the cause of loss: fire, lightning, smoke, explosions, storms, burst pipes, theft, and vandalism. It is designed to protect our tangible property. So if you've heard that term, that is stuff you can put your hands on, tangible property, not land. namely our buildings, our boilers, our transformers, some of those big items, and property inside and outside, the furniture that you're sitting in tonight, computers, fences, and so on. The current line of insurance that expires, like I said, November 20th, is right now at an annual premium of $679,000 and change. In bold here, and again, this is not uncommon, but nice, I guess, good news, is mentioning that a year ago, I came in front of you, or the members at the time, with a not-to-exceed premium amount of $778,683.70. So a week or so after this meeting, we ultimately bound that coverage for $679,814. So that was $98,000 and change less than what we'd asked not to exceed. And that was really because the changes really due to we raised the deductibles. So that's behind the scenes, Hickok and Boardman working with those carriers, negotiating right down to the 24th hour. And we raised the McNeil Station deductible from $1 million to $2 million. And then well as a gas turbine and Winooski Wind Hydro, each of those went from $500,000 to $1 million. So because of that, we decreased the premium that we came in front of you, which is good news. Moving down along.
Wait, can I ask a question about that?
yes.
So you increased the deductible on Winooski One and on McNeil?
Yes.
To lower the premium?
Yes.
So I'm just, obviously, I'm not an insurance person or anything, but given that we've had 2 floods in maybe 2 years, why did you decrease the
Increase the deductible.
Increase our liability,
Yep.
BED's liability.
So, yep, so on those, we have the line of insurance for that flood. It's pretty, the flood itself, we've had a couple FEMA-related floods, and they were nowhere near that limit. So the deductibles, that would have no impact on the flood insurance as far as the coverage for those sites.
You never got to that $1 million?
No, never reached that
Okay.
level. So
Did you
we'd
get to
ha-
the 500,000?
No, nowhere near that. So it's the deductible for McNeil itself, just because of the turbines are typically higher. So that's why those sites are the deductible here in this building is $25,000, just to give you an idea. So it's based on the exposure and the risk that goes along with what's at that site.
Okay.
Answer your question?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so like I mentioned, Hickok and Boardman is Acrisure working behind the scenes right up to look at not only premium, but what's called capacity, which is the largest amount the insurance company is willing to write or the market allow you to write. The TIV, that term stands for total insurable value, and that comes through the finance area. Really just a dollar amount of every single piece of property we own totaled up. So from computers all the way up to turbines. Deductibles and premiums. So I mentioned already the renewable premium. Just to give you an idea, that number, that not to exceed number of $679,000, which is 2.6, would be 2.6% lower than what we estimated our renewable premium to be when I put this budget together. We do our budgets in January, so fast forward to 10 months after that fact, we actually get the dollar amounts, 10 to 11 months. So just knowing that's good, 2.6% decrease. Okay, and again, a possibility that amount will come down. It will not go beyond the not to exceed amount. Not to bore you with a lot of numbers, but our total insurable value, it would be capped at $200 million. So regardless, we have about $340 million of insurance on every single thing that if we could insure. Insurance company is willing to underwrite that for numerous reasons. So it's capped at $200 million. Doesn't concern me at all because it would be a very rare event that this Pine Street building would go down at the same time that, say, McNeil or Winooski Wind Hydro. No fire is going to spread 3.5 miles and stuff. So it would take a major catastrophe to take out both these sites at the same time. Okay, so some of the things, what does Hickok and Boardman, what have they done for us and what are they doing for us? Because we do pay them. Just if you recall, some of you from last year, if you know anything about captive insurance, so Vermont is #1 in the world now. It was a year ago. Bermuda, Cayman Islands, and Vermont has been third. Last year we became #1. And captive insurance in a nutshell is really insuring the risk of your parent company. So it's somewhere between, at one extreme would be self-insuring, which is something we never would want to do. For the same reason you usually would not have insurance, not have insurance on your home or your auto. Okay, and then the other extreme is a traditional guaranteed cost insurance company. Somewhere in the middle is captive, a little more control, but harder startup fees. Sometimes there's assessments and finding legals, and there's a whole host of different types of captives. But we looked into those, and it was just priced out of the market. You'll see the note here, it's $975,000, and so we did not pursue that option this year. I talked about the deductibles already. I talked about the TIVs. And again, so still forthcoming, Hickok and Boardman is looking at if we wanted to consider increasing our deductibles even a little bit more, that they'll be presenting those in the next couple of weeks, and looking at our total insurable values and so on. Anything that we can do to save money, but again, right now, not to exceed the amount I mentioned before. They also looked at moving our workers' comp and our auto. So we share workers' comp and our auto programs with the city of Burlington. We're on this exact same policy through Travelers. So we're already looking at ideas and ways to lower that. We reached out to Liberty Mutual in July, but they're going through some restructuring that wasn't deemed favorable at the time, higher deductibles and so on. And Hickok and Boardman continue to look at those. And finally, we looked at combining BD's and the city of Burlington's cyber insurance policy. It's not a big line, but we're looking at many things. And it just wasn't in BD's benefit to maintain a separate policy, so we're still combined with the city on that. Okay, so down to the final numbers. I've mentioned some of this before, the timing on the impact on the budget. We put this budget together in January. This line of insurance runs from November through November. So if you can imagine, really the first 5 months are at one amount, the amount that we know at the time we put the budget together, and then the last 7 months at the typically higher amount or the new amount. So this particular budget was calculated 7 months at the $679,000 and then 7 months at the $735,000. Okay, and how do we come about that? So I work closely with Hickok and Boardman. There are really two pieces to a total premium increase. That's a rate change from the insurance company itself, and we projected or estimated a 5%, so that was built in the budget. And then I added a 3% for this TIV, the total insurable value. And we look at our numbers every year to decide how to go. So we had built in already in the budget basically an 8%. It's a cumulative amount. So that helped us when this number came in, using this not to exceed premium of $715,000. Like I mentioned before, that would be a 2.6 reduction in what we had used at the time of the budget. And an only, I say only in quotes because I was anticipating about 10%, a 5.3% increase over the expiring premium what we're paying right now. Okay? Again, final numbers have not come in yet. And I think most importantly, because we always talk about budget and they are critical, especially in our area, this last item here, this not to exceed premium of $715,989 would amount to a 1.5% decrease. And that's rare. So that's why I'm happy about it. A 1.57 decrease in our total fiscal year 25 budget for this line of insurance, from 712, if you will, to 700. So with all that being said, I will skip all the other handouts unless you want to see them. And I've listed here the resolution that I'm asking for your vote and support. Questions?
Remember the days when it was only a couple $100,000? We thought that was.
I remember those days, too.
Yeah, well, for the sake of time, I won't bore you too
Big
much.
money.
But way down here at the bottom, it's in your handout. Yeah, it's remarkable. I've been here 31 years, so in 1998 to 2001, I got a 3-year policy for about $68,000 a year on this line of insurance. And quite frankly, not much has changed. Capacity, reinsurance, investment, catastrophes, so on. Tremendous jump. I won't bore you, but you'll see those in those numbers there in this graph here, which you've seen. But it's just a tremendous spike in the numbers, and you can see the increase. Yeah, but it's I want to say leveling off. I mean, I don't want to say it is what it is, but there's a limited market and there's high risks. And it's not just our risk. That plan is well run and tremendous control. But if the insurance companies have bad exposure, just like your own auto and homeowners, one loss at a major facility like that, and it can be significant losses. So I think we're doing pretty good.
Questions?
Want me to pull up that resolution again?
You'll say if not, I will
No, it's right there.
entertain a motion.
You asking for a motion?
Yeah, sure.
I move to authorize the general manager of the Burlington Electric Department or their designee to execute the property, boiler, and machinery insurance coverage renewal contract with AIG, Zurich, Star, Tech, Aegis for the policy period November 20, 2024 through November 20, 2025, with a not-to-exceed premium of $715,989,000 as outlined in this memo, subject to review and approval of the city attorney's office, the city's chief administrative officer, board of finance, and the city council.
Motion, do I have a second?
Second.
Motion and seconded. All in favor of the motion indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed indicate by saying nay. 5 ayes, no nays. There you go, Paul.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Paul.
that. On to item number 9, Commissioners check-in. Kind of anything we may have skipped or thoughts that have come to your mind since throughout the discussion that we didn't quite cover or anything like that?
So one thing, the KPMG, that all was done now? It wasn't final, right? And then we looked at it and then now it's final.
You got an email.
Oh, I did, yeah.
Yeah, all complete.
Okay.
I'll just say that I'm heating my house with electricity, first time in 120 years. Not that I have historical records, but installed a ducted heat pump. It's for natural
Nice.
gas duct heat. So far, so good. And it's
Staying
good to
warm?
understand the experience of what that's like. So now we actually have natural gas, electric, and wood stove wood heat.
Wow.
Which I imagine a lot of folks in Burlington have that kind of mix. So it's just something I'm paying attention to and trying to understand as we think about our customers and understand what it takes to make a transition like that. So I need to understand and share with you all.
Do you know what they set your cutover
Congratulations.
point at for your thermostats?
30 or 40 around that.
Okay. Our
So it's been
efficiency team
running-
is always interested in that because
Yes.
sometimes they set it at 40, sometimes at 35, sometimes at 30. And we always are in favor of the lowest you can go while
Yes.
still being efficient. So it's always
I don't
interesting
know
to
why, I
hear
don't know
about.
for sure, but I remember we had a discussion and then he says it should be 35 or 40, but I don't
Yeah.
know precisely which.
Very cool.
And it's a hybrid unit, obviously.
So you go to electricity
Until it goes to 35-ish.
degrees?
Mhm. You stay at electricity and then it switches to natural gas,
Oh.
lower than that.
That's what we see with the ducted systems. And like if you have a
Right, not
ductless mini
like-
split, they'll run like to like -18 or something like that.
Yes.
But the ducted, we see between like 30 to 40 degrees typically is the cutover. That's right.
Are you seeing more non-hybrid units?
I like to think of it as hybrid houses, really. Like
Sure.
like you're describing, Michelle, like a lot of people have multiple sources now as we move towards electric again. So a lot of people have natural gas, we know that, whether it's boiler or a furnace, ducted or hydronic. And then people are adding, ductless mini splits, or if they have ductwork, they're adding a ducted heat pump. So they're getting a couple of sources in there, and they may have a fireplace or a wood stove or something like that. So I think we're in this like hybrid home environment now, much more than we were a few years back.
Because we fought for it not being a hybrid natural gas heat pump, ducted heat pump.
Oh,
and
really?
We had to go out for multiple bids to find it, and we love it.
Yeah.
We've had no issues. The transition point's been great. So
That's pretty
I just
good.
say that out loud. Is that it's huge to change to hybrid heat pumps, but I also
Yeah.
want to make sure that it gets more attention since it's a not as available option.
There's another thing that's kind of interesting in the hybrid space, which is induction cooking. Typically, you need a 240 volt outlet, and there are a couple that are on their way that have battery storage in the induction cook stove, so they can use a 120 outlet. While the stove is not on, they're charging up the battery, and then when there's a big draw, instead of having to draw off a 240, they can draw regular off a 120 and use the battery to supplement. And theoretically, if you had an outage, you could still cook. It's kind of, so there's some neat technology that's sort of on the horizon, not quite there yet, but we're seeing a lot of that type of setup in Burlington now. Yeah, so it's great. Yeah.
And I know Michelle has an old home. Do you also have an older home?
Yes. Yeah. I forget. It's not that old. It's not 120 years. But I think it's 1940. Yeah.
Cool.
80, 90 years.
Do all the rebates, a lot of them say that they end in 2024? Do they mostly roll over?
For us?
Yeah.
Yeah, we always do an end date just so we can kind of start the year fresh. So we go through a process filing usually around November timeframe with the PUC about what we're going to make changes to, and then we do a big announcement in January. This year it'll probably be January 8th is Mike walks into the room. We're planning tentatively to hold, to talk about our new incentives, updated incentives, what's changing, any new programs, things like that. So stay tuned for more on that as we hit the new year. But we'll be continuing our programs. There won't be for the most part, things just kind of keep going, and then we sometimes will throw in some wrinkles. Maybe something goes up or down, or we add an income eligibility piece. But stability for me in those programs is really important in the marketplace, particularly as the state and federal programs may fluctuate. We know for incentives, having stability and giving people the chance to continue to be able to access them is critical.
Other comments? I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
Motion, seconded, all in favor?
Aye.
We're adjourned. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.